poor dad sat next to a crying woman on a plane, and their connection was worth more than money. He's a widowed veteran, barely scraping by, just trying to make it home to the little girl who depends on him. But when he offers her a simple handkerchief, he discovers a heartbreaking secret that links her to the wife he thought he'd lost forever. The stranger on this plane knows something about his past, something that could explain the money that vanished, the sacrifices no one ever told him about. And just as hope flickers to life, a cruel threat pushes him to the edge of losing everything. Now, his fight for survival collides with a truth too powerful to ignore. Was it just fate that put a poor dad beside a crying woman on that plane? Or was it the start of a connection strong enough to change everything? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Earl Walker shifted uncomfortably in the narrow middle seat of Flight 2187 to Detroit. The worn fabric beneath him had long since lost its cushioning, but that wasn't what made him fidget. It was the careful mental math he couldn't stop doing in his head. $12 for airport coffee seemed like highway robbery. His weathered fingers traced the edges of the crumpled bills in his wallet one more time. The security guard job interview tomorrow morning felt like his last real shot at steady work. He needed to look sharp, sound sharp, and most importantly, get there on time. The Detroit Airport to Maple Run bus ticket would take most of what he had left. His stomach growled, reminding him that breakfast had been nothing but tap water and half a piece of toast. Earl closed his wallet with a quiet sigh and tucked it back into his jacket pocket. The coffee could wait. He reached down to the canvas bag wedged under the seat in front of him, fingers finding the familiar shape of Ruthie's Bible. The leather cover was smooth from years of handling, the pages gilt-edged but worn thin at the corners. Earl didn't need to open it to know exactly where her neat handwriting filled the margins with notes and prayers. The plane's engines hummed louder as more passengers filed down the narrow aisle. Earl kept his eyes down, trying to make himself smaller in the cramped space. A businessman in an expensive suit claimed the aisle seat, immediately pulling out a laptop and creating an invisible wall between them. A slight commotion at the front of the cabin caught Earl's attention. A middle-aged woman was apologizing repeatedly as she made her way down the aisle, her rolling carry-on bumping against seats despite her best efforts. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, but her face showed signs of distress. She paused at their row, double-checking her ticket. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice carrying a slight accent. "I believe I'm in the window seat." The businessman sighed dramatically but stood to let her pass. Earl rose too, careful to keep his balance in the tight space. As the woman settled into her seat, he couldn't help but notice she was clutching an old envelope and what looked like a Girl Scout badge against her chest. Her hands trembled slightly. Earl eased back into his seat, trying to give her as much space as possible. But in the close quarters, it was impossible not to notice when she lifted a hand to quickly wipe away tears. She turned toward the window, clearly trying to hide her distress. The businessman beside Earl had already put on noise-canceling headphones, deliberately oblivious. Earl sat perfectly still for a moment, his hands folded in his lap. Ruthie would know exactly what to do in this situation. He could almost hear her gentle voice chiding him for hesitating. Moving slowly, Earl reached into his breast pocket where he kept his one clean handkerchief. It was pressed and folded, saved for the interview tomorrow. But some things were more important than first impressions at job interviews. He cleared his throat softly. When the woman glanced his way, he held out the crisp white square of cotton. "Ma'am, would you like to use this?" She stared at the handkerchief for a moment, fresh tears welling in her eyes. "Oh, I couldn't. You're too kind." "Please," Earl said quietly. "My wife always said a clean handkerchief was meant to be shared when needed." Her fingers trembled slightly as she accepted it. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'm Ruby." "Ruby Alvarez." "Earl Walker," he replied with a small nod. "And it's no trouble at all." Ruby dabbed at her eyes with the handkerchief, careful not to smudge her makeup. The envelope in her lap crinkled slightly as she moved, and Earl caught a glimpse of familiar handwriting on the corner before she tucked it securely against the Girl Scout badge she held. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration at the front of the cabin. Earl sat back in his seat, giving Ruby privacy while she composed herself. The handkerchief had been a simple gesture, but somehow it felt right. Ruthie would have approved. The plane rumbled down the runway, engines roaring as it gathered speed. Earl gripped his armrests, a habit from years of flying that he'd never quite shaken. Beside him, Ruby Alvarez was still dabbing at her eyes with his handkerchief, trying to be discreet about her tears. The businessman in the aisle seat had already dozed off, his laptop forgotten in the seat pocket. As the plane lifted into the air, Earl watched Dallas shrink beneath them, the sprawling highways becoming delicate threads woven through patches of green and brown. Ruby sniffled quietly, her shoulders trembling with suppressed emotion. She kept one hand pressed against the envelope and badge in her lap while fumbling in her oversized purse with the other, presumably searching for tissues. The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, causing several passengers to gasp. The fastened seatbelt sign dinged back on, and the cabin shuddered. Ruby's purse, precariously balanced on her knees, tumbled forward, spilling its contents across the floor. "Oh no," she whispered, trying to reach for her scattered belongings while keeping her seatbelt fastened. "Let me help," Earl said, already unbuckling his belt. He'd weathered enough rough flights to know this patch of turbulence wasn't serious. The plane steadied as he carefully knelt in the cramped space, gathering lipstick, keys, and loose change. "You're very kind," Ruby said, accepting the items as he passed them up. Her voice was thick with emotion, but she managed a wobbly smile. "I'm not usually such a mess. We all have our days," Earl replied gently, retrieving a small leather-bound book that had slid under the seat in front. It looked like a prayer journal, well-loved with dog-eared pages and a ribbon bookmark. As he handed it back, something fluttered from between the pages, a handmade bookmark crafted from thick paper, decorated with pressed flowers and careful calligraphy. Earl caught it before it could slide away. He froze, staring at the words written in elegant script. "Ruthie Walker believes in you." The name hit him like a physical blow. Ruthie Walker. His Ruthie. The handwriting was unmistakable, the same precise loops and flourishes that filled the margins of the Bible in his bag. "Oh, thank you," Ruby said, reaching for the bookmark. "That's very precious to me." She noticed his expression and tilted her head. "Sir, are you all right? You've gone quite pale." Earl's mouth felt dry. He carefully passed her the bookmark, his hands trembling slightly. "That name," he managed. "Ruthie Walker." Ruby's eyes widened. "Did you know her?" "I've been searching for years, trying to find her, to thank her properly." She clutched the prayer journal to her chest. "She changed my life." "How?" Earl's voice was barely a whisper. Ruby's eyes grew distant, filled with memory. "It was 15 years ago. I was about to be forced out of college. My scholarship had been revoked after I spoke up about discrimination in the housing department. I had no family money to fall back on." She touched the envelope in her lap. "Then this arrived, an anonymous donation, exactly the amount I needed to finish my degree. The only identification was the name R. Walker on the check." She opened the envelope carefully, showing Earl a yellowed thank you letter she'd written but never been able to send. "Later, I received this bookmark in the mail. No return address, just these words. Ruthie Walker believes in you. I've carried it ever since, trying to live up to that faith she showed in me." Earl's fingers found the outline of Ruthie's Bible in his bag. The mystery of their depleted savings account during her final year, the money he'd thought had been lost to medical billing errors. He remembered their argument about it, Ruthie's calm insistence that everything would work out. "The scholarship money," he said slowly. "How much was it?" $5,000. Ruby replied. "I know that might not sound like much now, but back then." She shook her head. It was everything. It let me finish my law degree. Now I run a housing advocacy nonprofit, helping other families facing discrimination. She smiled softly. All because one woman believed in me. Earl gripped the bookmark, his vision blurring. The pressed flowers were from their garden. He recognized the purple coneflowers Ruthie had loved so much. The paper was from her special stationery set, the one she'd used for important letters and church committee notes. "Sir?" Ruby touched his arm gently. "Did you know her? Can you tell me where to find her? I've wanted for so long to say thank you." Earl drew a shaky breath, his weathered hand still holding the bookmark. "Ruthie was my wife." Ruby's eyes widened, and her hand flew to her mouth. "Was?" "She passed 3 years ago." Earl's voice was soft but steady. "Cancer." The plane had leveled out now, the earlier turbulence forgotten. Sunlight streamed through the small window, catching the pressed flowers on the bookmark, making their faded colors glow. "Oh my goodness," Ruby whispered, tears welling up again. "I can't believe. All these years, I've been carrying a piece of your wife's kindness with me." Earl nodded, carefully returning the bookmark to her. "That's Ruthie's handwriting, all right. And those flowers? Purple coneflowers? She grew them in our garden in Maple Run. Said they were tough enough to handle Michigan winters, but still knew how to dance in the summer breeze." Ruby traced the flowers with gentle fingers. "Maple Run? That's where I'm headed. I have a housing rights case there." She shook her head in wonder. "This can't be coincidence." "Ruthie didn't believe in coincidences," Earl said, a slight smile tugging at his lips. "She called them God's way of staying anonymous." Ruby laughed softly, wiping away fresh tears with his handkerchief. "She sounds wonderful." "She was." Earl pulled out his Bible, its cover soft and worn from years of use. "See here?" He opened it carefully, showing Ruby the margins filled with neat handwriting. She wrote notes everywhere. Prayers for people, quotes she liked, little reminders of God's faithfulness. Ruby leaned closer, studying the familiar handwriting. "The same as my bookmark," she whispered. "Mr. Walker." "Earl, please." "Earl, would you tell me about her? About the woman who believed in me?" Earl settled back in his seat, the Bible open in his lap. Ruthie taught Sunday school for 30 years, worked as a secretary at the high school too. She knew every kid in town, seemed like. Always noticed the ones who needed extra help or encouragement. Did she help other students like me? Must have, Earl said thoughtfully. Though I'm learning she kept some of her giving private, even from me. He paused, remembering. She was smart about money, could stretch a dollar further than anyone I knew. Always said we were rich in what mattered. Ruby nodded eagerly. The timing of her gift. It wasn't just about the money. I was ready to give up, you see. Not just on school, but on believing things could change. I'd filed a complaint about discriminatory housing policies in the student apartments, and suddenly my scholarship was under review. She straightened her shoulders. That money meant someone believed I was right to speak up. That sounds like Ruthie, Earl said. She hated bullies. Quiet about it, but firm. Wouldn't back down when she knew something wasn't right. Her gift changed everything, Ruby continued. I finished my law degree, started working with housing rights groups. Now I run my own nonprofit, helping families fight discrimination and predatory landlords. She smiled through her tears. Every time I win a case, every family I help stay in their home, that's Ruthie's legacy too. The flight attendant passed by with the beverage cart, but Earl barely noticed. His mind was spinning, pieces falling into place like a puzzle he hadn't known he was solving. Would you tell me more about your work? He asked. The cases you handle? For the next hour, they talked. Ruby described her advocacy work, the families she helped, the battles against unfair evictions and housing discrimination. Earl shared stories about Ruthie, her garden, her faith, her quiet way of helping others without drawing attention to herself. As the plane began its descent into Detroit, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom announcing their approach. Earl's thoughts drifted to that argument with Ruthie about 3 months before her diagnosis. He'd been reviewing their accounts, planning for retirement, when he discovered several $1,000s missing from their savings. "What happened to our nest egg?" he'd demanded, waving the bank statement. Ruthie had just smiled that serene smile of hers. "The Lord knows what we need," she'd said, "and sometimes what we need is to help someone else." He'd been angry then, worried about their future. But Ruthie had remained calm, assuring him everything would work out. Now, looking at Ruby, this accomplished woman who'd turned one act of kindness into a career of helping others, Earl finally understood. The missing money hadn't been lost to medical bills or bank errors as he'd assumed. Ruthie had given it away, invested it in someone else's future. $5,000, exactly the amount Ruby had mentioned. Their retirement nest egg had become someone else's launching pad. Earl closed his Bible, running his thumb along its worn edges. He thought about the other notes in Ruthie's precise handwriting, scattered through the pages. How many other bookmarks had she made? How many other students had received anonymous gifts with simple notes of encouragement? The plane banked gently, beginning its final approach to Detroit. Ruby carefully tucked her precious bookmark back into her prayer journal. "I've been carrying this for 15 years, she said softly, trying to find her, to say thank you. "And here you are, sitting right next to me." The Detroit airport buzzed with afternoon activity as Earl and Ruby made their way down to baggage claim. After sharing such an emotional connection on the plane, the fluorescent lights and loud announcements felt jarring, too harsh for the tender moment they'd just experienced. "My suitcase is at Carousel 4, Ruby said, adjusting her purse strap. "I need to make a quick stop at the ladies' room first." Earl nodded, still carrying his Bible close. "I'll keep an eye out for your bag. The red one with the butterfly tag, right?" "That's it. Thank you, Earl." Ruby squeezed his arm before heading toward the restrooms. Standing by the slowly turning carousel, Earl pulled out his phone. He'd turned it off for the flight, and now it chirped with notifications. 3 missed calls and a voicemail, all from the same number, Maple Run Properties. His stomach tightened. Nothing good ever came from that office. Earl pressed play and held the phone to his ear, trying to hear over the airport noise. "Mr. Walker." The property manager's voice dripped with barely concealed disdain. "This is your final notice regarding lot rent for spaces 23 and 24. You're 2 months behind, totaling $1,200. Payment in full is required by Friday at 5 p.m., or eviction proceedings will begin immediately." Earl's free hand clenched into a fist. He'd been scraping together what he could, but between Mia's school supplies and the rising cost of her asthma medication, the message continued. "Additionally, there have been complaints about excessive noise and visitors. We have concerns about the demographic changes your granddaughter's playmates are bringing to our family-oriented community. Perhaps a different neighborhood would be more suitable for your situation." Blood rushed to Earl's face. He knew exactly what the manager meant by demographic changes. Last week, Mia had invited her best friends, Keisha and Maria, over for a birthday party. The girls had played hopscotch and jumped rope in front of the trailer, their laughter echoing through the normally quiet park. The message ended with details about acceptable payment methods, but Earl barely heard them. He stood rigid, jaw tight, staring unseeing at the rotating baggage carousel. The Bible in his hand seemed heavier now, and he could almost hear Ruthie's voice reading from its pages about loving your neighbor and protecting the innocent. A flash of red caught his eye. Ruby's suitcase, with its cheerful butterfly tag. Earl reached for it automatically, his movements mechanical as his mind raced through calculations. He had about $800 saved up. Could he borrow the rest? The VFW might have emergency assistance for veterans, but he hated asking for help. "Earl?" Ruby's voice cut through his thoughts. She stood nearby, her advocate's eyes taking in his rigid posture and troubled expression. "I couldn't help but overhear. That message wasn't good news, was it?" He tried to force a smile, but it wouldn't come. "Nothing I can't handle." Ruby's face softened with concern. "That man's tone. And what he said about your granddaughter." "Mia," Earl said quietly. "She's 8. Lost her parents in a car accident when she was 3. Her mama, my daughter Sarah, married a wonderful man named Marcus. They were both teachers." He swallowed hard. "Mia's all I have left of them." Ruby reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. The simple design read, "Ruby Alvarez, Housing Rights Advocate," with contact information below. "No one should talk about a child like that," she said softly, holding out the card. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Maple Run Cemetery as Earl's old pickup truck crunched to a stop on the gravel path. Ruby sat quietly in the passenger seat, holding Earl's worn Bible in her lap. Neither had spoken much during the 20-minute drive from the airport, both lost in their own thoughts about Ruthie Walker and the strange way their paths had crossed. Earl turned off the engine but kept his hands on the steering wheel. "It's just up there," he said, nodding toward a gentle slope dotted with oak trees. "Row 14, near the big maple." Ruby waited while Earl came around to open her door, a gesture that spoke of his generation's ingrained courtesy. Together they walked up the gentle incline, their footsteps hushed against the neat grass. The air held the warmth of late summer, carrying the sweet scent of nearby wildflowers. When they reached Ruthie's headstone, Earl stopped and cleared his throat. The simple granite marker read, "Are Ruth Ann Walker, beloved wife, mother, and friend, her children rise up and call her blessed, 1962 2019." Ruby knelt down and traced the engraved words with gentle fingers. "She chose Proverbs 31, she whispered. "Of course she did." Earl nodded, his voice rough. That was Ruthie, always thinking of others as her children. He gestured to the Bible Ruby still held. "Would you mind?" Ruby handed him the Bible, and Earl opened it carefully. The pages naturally fell open to a well-worn section, and there, in the margin, was Ruthie's neat handwriting. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were clear. "If you're reading this, we gave it where it would grow." "She knew," Earl said softly. "She knew I'd find out someday about what she'd done with our savings, and she left this message to tell me it was okay." Ruby wiped her eyes. "She gave me more than money for tuition, Earl. She gave me belief in myself when everyone else said I didn't belong in law school. That bookmark, 'Ruthie Walker believes in you,' I've carried it through every hard day since." Earl sank down onto a nearby bench, his fingers tracing Ruthie's handwriting. "We'd saved that money for retirement. When it disappeared, I thought there had been some mistake with her medical bills. We argued about it, the only real fight we ever had. She just kept saying, 'Trust me, Earl. Some things are worth more than money.'" Ruby sat beside him. She was right. Look at what grew from her gift. I became a housing rights advocate. I've helped hundreds of families keep their homes, fight discrimination. She paused, then added gently, "And now, somehow, I'm here to help you." Earl stiffened slightly. "About that phone message at the airport, I appreciate the offer, but you're proud," Ruby finished. "Like I was proud, not wanting to accept help for school. But Ruthie taught me something important. Sometimes letting others help you is how you help even more people down the line." The setting sun painted the cemetery in soft gold, making the headstones glow. A warm breeze rustled the maple leaves above them, and somewhere in the distance, a mourning dove called. "What they said about Mia." Earl's voice cracked. "My grandbaby just wanted a birthday party with her friends. 8-year-olds playing hopscotch shouldn't be a threat to anyone's family-oriented community." Ruby's hand found Earl's weathered one. "No, they shouldn't. And that kind of coded language? That's exactly what housing discrimination looks like today. It's why I do what I do." Earl looked down at their joined hands, then at Ruthie's grave, then at the Bible with its hidden message. The pieces seemed to click into place. The handkerchief on the plane, the bookmark that had preserved Ruby's faith, and now this moment of connection at Ruthie's final resting place. She always said everything happens for a reason, Earl murmured. Meeting you on that flight, finding out about the scholarship, reading this note today. Ruby squeezed his hand. Maybe we're meant to honor her legacy together. You with your dignity and strength, me with my legal knowledge. We could help others the way she helped me. Earl was quiet for a long moment, watching the shadows lengthen across Ruthie's grave. Finally, he straightened his shoulders, the subtle movement of a veteran finding his resolve. We can start with saving my home, he said. Not just for me and Mia, but for all the families in that park facing the same treatment. Together, Ruby agreed firmly. For Ruthie. Earl carefully closed the Bible, tucking it under his arm. He stood and helped Ruby to her feet, both of them taking one last look at the headstone glowing in the sunset light. For Ruthie, Earl echoed, and for every person who needs someone to believe in them. They walked back to Earl's truck as the first stars began appearing in the deepening blue sky. Their connection, born of a chance meeting and cemented by gratitude and grief, had become something more, a promise to carry forward Ruthie's legacy of quiet generosity and fierce love. The kitchen in Earl's modest trailer smelled of cornbread and simmered beans. Earl watched as Mia carefully set their small table with mismatched plates, her pigtails swinging as she hummed a tune from school. The evening light filtered through thin curtains, casting warm patterns across their worn linoleum floor. And then, Miss Thompson said, "My science project could go in the hallway display." Mia bounced in her chair as Earl spooned beans onto her plate. "Can we get poster board tomorrow, Grandpa? I want to make it really special." Earl set a thick wedge of golden cornbread beside her beans. "Let's see what we can do, sugar." He tried to keep his voice steady, not wanting her to hear the worry beneath his words. The poster board would cost $3 they didn't have to spare. "I'm going to draw the whole solar system," Mia continued, breaking her cornbread into little pieces. "Jupiter's going to be huge, and I'll put glitter on Saturn's rings." She paused, fork halfway to her mouth. "Do we have any glitter?" "We'll check your craft box," Earl said, though he knew they'd used the last of it making birthday cards for her friend Teresa. He watched Mia eat, her small face animated as she described each planet she would draw. The kitchen light caught the soft brown of her skin, so like her mother's, and Earl's chest tightened with familiar grief and fierce love. "What about Neptune?" he asked, forcing himself to take a bite of cornbread. "You going to make that one blue?" "Super blue." Mia nodded enthusiastically. "And I'm going to write all the facts about it too. Did you know Neptune has winds that go faster than any hurricane on Earth? Is that right?" Earl managed a smile, even as his mind wandered to the property manager's voicemail. Friday's deadline loomed like a storm on the horizon. Where would they do science projects if they lost their home? Where would Mia do her homework or eat her breakfast or play with her friends? "Grandpa?" Mia's voice pulled him back. "You're not eating." Earl looked down at his barely touched plate. "Just thinking about how smart my girl is getting," he said, picking up his fork, "making her grandpa proud every day." Mia beamed, then grew serious. "Are you worried about money again?" The question hit Earl like a physical blow. He'd tried so hard to shield her from his concerns, but children saw more than adults gave them credit for. "What makes you ask that, sugar?" "You do that thing with your forehead," Mia demonstrated, scrunching her face up. "And you check your wallet a lot. And sometimes you skip lunch when you think I'm not looking." Earl set his fork down, his appetite completely gone now. "Mia, honey, it's okay," she said quickly. "I don't need the glitter for my project. Or we can use the old sparkly nail polish Teresa gave me." That would work too, right? The simple practicality of her solution, the way she was already learning to make do with less, made Earl's eyes burn. He reached across the table and took her small hand in his weathered one. "Listen to me, Mia Walker. You let me worry about the money. That's my job as your grandpa. Your job is to be 8 years old and make the best solar system that School Hallway has ever seen. Mia squeezed his fingers. But what if— No what ifs. At the supper table, Earl said firmly, falling back on one of Ruthie's old rules. Now tell me more about those Neptune winds. They faster than your cousin Marcus's motorbike? The distraction worked. Mia launched into a detailed comparison of planetary wind speeds versus various vehicles she knew, her earlier concern temporarily forgotten. Earl made himself finish his beans, nodding at appropriate intervals and asking questions to keep her talking. After supper, Mia helped load their dishes into the sink, standing on her tiptoes to reach. Earl was just starting the hot water when his phone buzzed. Ruby's name appeared on the screen. "Evening, Ms. Alvarez," he answered, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Earl," Ruby's warm voice came through clearly. "I hope I'm not calling too late. I spoke with some people at my church about your situation, people who might be able to help." Earl's grip tightened on the phone. "I'm not looking for charity, not charity," Ruby cut in gently. "Community, Deacon Lorraine Parker and Miss Hattie Cole would like to meet with you tomorrow at First Baptist." They knew Ruthie. Earl glanced at Mia, who was carefully drying a plate with intense concentration. "I appreciate the thought, but Earl Walker, your pride is talking louder than your sense right now." Ruby's tone was kind but firm. "Remember what we promised at the cemetery? Together? For Ruthie?" The memory of that sunset moment, of Ruthie's words in the Bible margin, settled something in Earl's chest. "What time tomorrow?" 10 o'clock. The church basement has good coffee and better company." After saying goodbye, Earl finished the dishes while Mia got ready for bed. He helped her brush her teeth and checked that her backpack was ready for school tomorrow. When she was tucked under her worn but clean quilt, she asked for a song. "Which one tonight?" Earl sat on the edge of her bed, smoothing back her dark hair. "The one Grandma Ruthie liked best, about the arms." Earl's throat tightened, but he began to hum softly, leaning, safe and secure from all alarms. The familiar melody filled the small bedroom, and Mia's eyes grew heavy. By the second verse, her breathing had deepened into sleep. He watched her for a moment longer, this precious girl who carried Ruthie's spirit in her gentle heart. Tomorrow he would swallow his pride and meet with Ruby's church friends. Tonight, he would trust that somehow, like Ruthie's long-ago gift to Ruby, their connection was worth more than money. The morning sun cast long shadows as Earl and Mia walked the 3 blocks to First Baptist Church. Mia skipped ahead, her backpack bouncing with each step. She'd insisted on coming before school, curious about meeting her grandma's friends. "Is this where Grandma Ruthie used to go?" Mia asked, pausing to wait for Earl at the corner. "Every Sunday," Earl replied, his dress shoes clicking against the sidewalk. He'd polished them that morning, wanting to look presentable despite his worn jacket, and most Wednesdays too. The red brick church stood solid and familiar, its white steeple reaching into the blue morning sky. Earl hadn't been inside since Ruthie's funeral. His steps slowed as they approached the side entrance leading to the basement. "Come on, Grandpa," Mia tugged at his hand. "I smell something good." The aroma of coffee and fresh-baked muffins drifted up the concrete steps. Earl took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and followed Mia down into the warmth of the church basement. Ruby was already there, sitting at a round table with 2 older women. One was Deacon Lorraine Parker, tall and stately in a purple dress, her silver hair swept up elegantly. Beside her sat Miss Hattie Cole, small and bird-like, her glasses catching the fluorescent light as she turned toward the door. "Well, if it isn't Earl Walker himself!" Deacon Lorraine's rich voice filled the room. She stood, arms opening wide. "And this must be Miss Mia. Look at you, child, pretty as a spring morning." Mia pressed closer to Earl's side, suddenly shy. Miss Hattie smiled gently and pushed a plate of blueberry muffins toward the empty chairs. "Your grandmother used to bring these same muffins to our teachers' meetings," she said to Mia. "Would you like one?" The mention of Ruthie seemed to ease something in the air. Earl guided Mia to a seat. nodding thanks as Ruby poured him coffee in a thick church mug. The familiar smell of basement coffee and old hymnals tugged at his heart. "Now then," Deacon Lorraine said, once they were settled. "Ruby here has been telling us about your meeting on that plane. Lord does work in mysterious ways, doesn't he?" "Yes, ma'am," Earl replied politely, watching Mia carefully break her muffin into small pieces. Miss Hattie reached down beside her chair and lifted a worn manila folder onto the table. "We've been keeping something for Ruthie," she said, her thin fingers smoothing the folder's edge. "A record of sorts." Earl's coffee cup paused halfway to his mouth. "A record?" "Your Ruthie," Miss Hattie continued. "She used to come to me with names. Students who needed a little help, books, supplies, sometimes tuition." She opened the folder, revealing neat columns of handwritten entries. "I kept track, you see. Dates, amounts, results." Ruby leaned forward, her eyes bright with interest. "Like a ledger?" "Exactly like that." Miss Hattie adjusted her glasses. "Ruthie knew I'd been the school secretary before teaching. She trusted my bookkeeping." She smiled at Earl. "She never wanted recognition. Just results." Earl's throat tightened as he scanned the careful notes. Names jumped out at him, kids he remembered from church, from the neighborhood. Beside each entry were specific amounts: 42.5 for graduation robes, 157 for community college textbooks, 498 for a semester's bus pass. "Here's my name," Ruby said softly, pointing to an entry near the bottom. The amount listed made Earl's hands shake slightly. It was more than he'd made in 3 months at the plant. "But how?" he started, then stopped, remembering the mysterious withdrawals from their savings, the arguments about missing money. He'd assumed medical bills or banking errors. All this time, "Your Ruthie was clever about it," Deacon Lorraine said, her voice gentle. "She'd sell extra baked goods, do alterations, watch people's children. Little by little, she'd build up what she called her seed money." Mia, who had been quietly listening while eating her muffin, spoke up. "Like when you plant flowers? You need seeds?" "Exactly like that, sugar," Deacon Lorraine beamed. "Your grandma was planting seeds of hope, and look how they've grown." She gestured to Ruby. "A lawyer fighting for people's homes. And there are others, teachers, nurses, pastors, mechanics, all from Ruthie's little seeds." Earl stared at the names, remembering faces. Tommy Jenkins, now running his own garage. Maria Santos, teaching 3rd grade at Mia's school. Each one a secret investment in the future, made by his wife without fanfare or recognition. "We thought," Ruby said carefully, "maybe we could find these people, bring them together for a supper, like a reunion, let them know where the help came from. Show folks what quiet faith can do," Deacon Lorraine added. "Might inspire some more seed planting." Earl traced Ruthie's familiar handwriting with one finger. "Don't know if I'm the right person to—" "You're exactly the right person," Miss Hattie interrupted firmly. "You're her husband. These people should hear from you how Ruthie believed in them before they even believed in themselves. And they need to know," Ruby added, "that the same spirit that helped them is still needed. That there are more seeds to plant, more justice to grow." Earl looked at Mia, happily picking blueberries out of her muffin. He thought about the eviction notice, about Brent Hallowell's smug voice on the phone, about all the other families facing the same struggles. "When?" he asked finally. "Next Saturday?" Ruby suggested. "I can help make calls, spread the word." "I'll handle the food," Deacon Lorraine declared. "Can't have a proper reunion without proper feeding. And I have addresses for most everyone." Miss Hattie patted the folder. "At least their families, if they've moved away." Earl nodded slowly, feeling the weight of Ruthie's legacy settling on his shoulders. It wasn't a burden, though, more like a mantle, warm and familiar as his old work jacket. "I'm not much for public speaking," he warned. "Just tell them about Ruthie." Ruby smiled, about her quiet way of changing lives, about how help given in faith multiplies beyond counting. Like Neptune's superfast winds, Mia piped up, making the adults laugh. Exactly like that. Earl squeezed her shoulder, grateful for her simple wisdom. He looked around the table at these women. Ruby, with her legal pad already out, Deacon Lorraine mentally planning menus, Miss Hattie with her precious records, and Mia, Ruthie's greatest legacy, watching him with trust in her eyes. "All right then," he said. "Let's gather Ruthie's garden and see what grows." The morning sun cast long shadows as Earl, Ruby, and Mia walked down Maple Street. Ruby held a notebook with addresses from Miss Hattie's records, while Mia skipped ahead, counting house numbers out loud. 217, 219. Mia paused at a small blue house with peeling paint. 221. This is it, Grandpa. Earl checked the address against Ruby's list. Maria Santos, he read. Says here she got help with teaching certification tests. Ruby smoothed her blazer and climbed the worn wooden steps. Earl noticed how she straightened her shoulders before knocking, as if preparing for court. The door opened to reveal a young woman in scrubs, dark circles under her eyes, suggesting a night shift just ended. "Mrs. Santos?" Ruby asked warmly. "I'm Ruby Alvarez, and this is Earl Walker. We're here about Ruthie Walker." Maria's tired face lit up. "Mrs. Walker, please come in. I just got home from the hospital, but I'd love to talk." She ushered them into a small living room where children's artwork covered the walls. "I'm actually Ms. Martinez now. Got married last spring. But I'll never forget Mrs. Walker." They settled onto a worn couch while Maria pulled up a kitchen chair. Mia wandered over to examine the crayon masterpieces on display. "I was about to give up on teaching," Maria began, tucking her legs under her. "The certification tests cost so much, and I'd failed the math portion twice. My ESL students needed me, but I couldn't afford another try." She smiled softly. "Then this envelope appeared in my mailbox. Exact amount for one more test, plus a note saying, 'Third time's the charm.'" Earl's throat tightened. He remembered Ruthie working late those weeks, saying she had extra mending to do. "Now I teach 3rd grade at Lincoln Elementary," Maria continued. "Every time I help a struggling student, I think of Mrs. Walker's kindness." "My granddaughter Mia goes to Lincoln," Earl said quietly. Maria beamed. "Room 312? "Of course! I should have recognized her. She's one of our brightest." They talked a while longer, Maria sharing stories of her students. When they left, she pressed a crayon drawing into Mia's hands, a rainbow-colored heart surrounded by math symbols. Their next stop was Tommy's Auto Repair, a small garage on the edge of town. The sound of machinery grew louder as they approached, and the smell of oil and rubber filled the air. "Mr. Jenkins?" Ruby called over the noise. A man in grease-stained coveralls rolled out from under a lifted car. "That's me," he said, wiping his hands on a red shop rag. His eyes widened when Earl introduced himself. "Walker? Like Mrs. Walker from First Baptist?" Earl nodded, and Tommy immediately shut off the compressor. "Folks, take a break," he called to his workers. "This is important." He led them to a small office, clearing stacks of invoices from 2 plastic chairs. "Your wife," he said to Earl, "she saved my whole future." Tommy explained how he'd been struggling in high school, working part-time at a quick lube place to help his mom with bills. "I was good with cars, but technical school seemed impossible. Then someone paid my first semester's tuition." He gestured around the garage. "Now I own this place, employ 6 people, train apprentices from the high school." Earl noticed the framed certificates on the wall, ASE certifications, business licenses, even a Chamber of Commerce award. "Best part?" Tommy grinned. "My oldest just started college, engineering, first in our family." Their final visit was to Mercy Hospital, where Sarah Chen worked as a pediatric nurse. They found her in the children's ward, cartoon characters decorating her scrub top. "Oh my goodness," she whispered when they explained their visit. "I've been wanting to thank Mrs. Walker's family for years." Sarah led them to the break room, where she shared how she'd almost dropped out of nursing school after her father's stroke. The program wouldn't let me make up clinical hours I missed caring for him. I needed to repeat the semester, but we had no money left. Her eyes grew misty. Then this miracle happened. Someone paid my tuition and left a note. Caregivers need care too. She touched Earl's hand. That was your wife, wasn't it? Earl could only nod, remembering how Ruthie had sold her mother's silver that month. I've been here 10 years now, Sarah said proudly. When families are struggling with sick kids, I remember Mrs. Walker's kindness. Sometimes a little help at the right moment changes everything. The sun was setting when they finally headed home. Mia clutched her crayon drawing, chattering about wanting to be a teacher, nurse, mechanic when she grew up. Ruby's notebook was full of names and stories, each one a thread in the tapestry of Ruthie's quiet generosity. Earl walked them to Ruby's car, his heart full but heavy. "Thank you," he said as she opened the door, "for helping uncover all this." Ruby squeezed his arm. "We're not done yet. The supper's going to be beautiful." After tucking Mia into bed that night, Earl lay awake in his quiet room. The day's stories swirled in his mind. Lives transformed by Ruthie's sacrifice, dreams made possible by her faith in others. Pride in his wife's secret ministry warmed his heart, but the warmth couldn't quite chase away his fears. The eviction notice sat on his kitchen table, Friday's deadline looming. His small savings wouldn't cover the back rent. The thought of losing their home, of failing to protect Mia, gnawed at him. Rolling onto his side, Earl stared at the empty space where Ruthie used to sleep. "What would you do, Ruthie?" he whispered into the darkness. The question hung in the air, unanswered except by the soft ticking of the bedside clock. Earl's kitchen table groaned under the weight of manila folders and stacks of paper. Ruby spread out documents like playing cards, her usually cheerful face tight with concentration. Morning sunlight streamed through the window, catching dust motes dancing above their impromptu command center. "Look at this pattern," Ruby said, tapping a spreadsheet with her pen. "Every time a Black or Hispanic family applies for one of Brent's properties, they get hit with extra credit verification fees. But white applicants? Standard rates." Earl leaned forward, squinting at the columns of numbers. The coffee in his mug had gone cold, forgotten as they'd pored over evidence for the past 2 hours. "How'd you get all this?" Public records, mostly. Plus some brave tenants shared their paperwork. Ruby shuffled through more files, but that's just the beginning. "See these maintenance requests?" She laid out work orders side by side. Earl recognized the forms. He'd filled out plenty himself when their heating went out last winter. "What am I looking at?" "White tenants get repairs within days. Everyone else? Weeks, sometimes months." Ruby's voice carried the quiet anger of someone who'd seen this story too many times. "And look who gets the rent increases." Earl's jaw clenched as he studied the patterns. Veterans like himself, single mothers, immigrants, all targeted with steep hikes and mysterious fees. The numbers painted an ugly picture of calculated discrimination hiding behind paperwork and policies. "Here's yours." Ruby pulled out his file, dog-eared and thick. 3 repair requests ignored, then sudden charges for property maintenance you never received. And now, this back rent demand, right when Mia started having friends over. Earl's hands curled into fists under the table. He thought of Mia's birthday party last month, how some parents had hesitated to drop their kids off at the trailer park, how the property manager had happened to inspect the yard that same day, taking photos and making notes. "They're trying to push us out," he said quietly. "Make it too expensive, too difficult to stay." Ruby nodded. "It's an old playbook. Price out the undesirables, bring in higher-paying tenants, call it neighborhood improvement." She pulled out her phone, showing Earl a glossy website. "Brent's already advertising luxury renovations for this area." Earl stood abruptly, needing to move. He paced the small kitchen, past Mia's artwork on the fridge, past the window where Ruthie used to watch birds at their feeder. "All these years I thought it was just bad luck, bad timing. But they planned it? Systematic discrimination?" Ruby confirmed, hidden under enough bureaucracy to make it look legal. But we've got the numbers now. We can prove the pattern. A knock at the door interrupted them. Mrs. Johnson from 3 trailers down stood on the steps, wringing her hands around an envelope. Earl, sorry to bother you, but I heard Ms. Alvarez was here. Come in, Dorothy, Earl said, pulling out another chair. The elderly woman sank into it, hands shaking as she opened the envelope. Got this notice yesterday. They're raising my rent again, 3rd time this year. Say it's for community improvements, but I haven't seen any. Her voice wavered. I can't. On my Social Security. Ruby glanced at her watch, then at Earl. He knew she was thinking of his security guard interview scheduled for 11 o'clock. A steady job, health insurance, a chance to build up savings again. The responsible choice would be to leave now, make sure he arrived early. But Mrs. Johnson's hands were trembling, and the papers on his table told a story bigger than one missed interview. Earl remembered how she'd watched Mia after school when Ruthie got sick, how she still brought over soup when anyone had a cold. Let's look at that notice, he said, pulling his chair closer. Ruby smiled softly and opened her laptop. They spent the next hour reviewing Mrs. Johnson's rental history, documenting the pattern of increases that matched their earlier findings. Ruby explained tenant rights while Earl made coffee. The familiar routine of hosting neighbors, settling over his worry about the missed interview. We can file a complaint, Ruby said, printing forms on her portable printer. And there's a tenants' rights meeting tonight at First Baptist. You should both come. Strength in numbers. Mrs. Johnson clutched the papers like lifelines. You really think we can fight this? Together? Ruby looked at Earl, her expression both questioning and confident. Absolutely. After Mrs. Johnson left, Earl slumped in his chair. That interview would have helped with the back rent. I know. Ruby gathered their evidence into neat piles. But this fight? This is bigger than one job. This is about everyone's home, everyone's dignity. She touched his arm gently. This is what Ruthie would do. Earl looked at the stack of documents, proof of years of quiet cruelty dressed up as business. He thought of Mrs. Johnson's trembling hands, of Mia's friends whose families were also facing increases, of all the neighbors who'd helped each other through hard times. You're right, he said finally. Some things matter more than money. Ruby nodded, understanding in her eyes. We'll find another way with the rent, but right now, we've got work to do. They bent back over the papers, mapping out patterns of injustice, building their case one document at a time. The missed interview hung in the air like a question mark, but Earl felt steadier than he had in weeks. This was a different kind of security, the kind that came from standing up for what was right. The aroma of home-cooked meals filled First Baptist's basement. Casserole dishes lined long tables covered in checkered cloths, while slow cookers bubbled with hearty soups and stews. Earl stood near the entrance, overwhelmed by the turnout. People kept streaming in, each carrying a dish and a story about Ruthie. Ruby worked the room like a natural hostess, greeting folks and directing them to empty spots at the tables. She wore a bright blue dress that matched the joy in her eyes as she hugged each newcomer. Deacon Lorraine supervised the kitchen crew, making sure everything stayed warm and ready. Mr. Walker? A young woman in nursing scrubs approached Earl, balancing a green bean casserole. I'm Sarah Martinez. Your wife helped me buy my first semester's textbooks. She set down her dish and pulled out a worn thank you card from her pocket. I kept this all these years. Earl's throat tightened as he read the familiar handwriting. Books open doors. Walk through them with confidence. R.W. More people gathered around, each sharing their memories. A mechanic named James told how Ruthie's gift had covered his certification exam fees. A choir director remembered money appearing for her graduate school application. A pastor spoke of emergency rent assistance during seminary. She never wanted credit, Earl said softly, watching the room fill with faces. Just said we had to help where we could. The church basement buzzed with conversation and laughter. Mia darted between tables, collecting stories for a special notebook Ruby had given her. "Grandpa," she called out, "did you know Mrs. Turner was one of Mama Ruthie's kids, too?" Miss Hattie's careful records had revealed over 30 recipients of Ruthie's quiet generosity scattered throughout Maple Run. Tonight, most of them had come home to say, "Thank you." Pastor Isaiah stood at the front of the room, tapping a glass for attention. "Before we eat, the choir has prepared something special." He nodded to the group assembling near the piano. This was Ruthie Walker's favorite hymn. The first notes of "Great is Thy Faithfulness" floated through the air. Earl closed his eyes, remembering Sunday mornings with Ruthie in their usual pew, her voice clear and strong beside him. The choir's harmony swelled, filling the space with melody. "Great is Thy faithfulness, great is Thy faithfulness. Morning by morning new mercies I see." Ruby appeared at Earl's side, slipping her hand into his. Tears streamed down her face, but she was smiling. Around them, others joined in the singing. Nurses, teachers, mechanics, and pastors, all connected by one woman's generous heart. When the song ended, Pastor Isaiah raised his hands. "Let's pray and eat. But first, Earl, Ruby, would you come up here?" They made their way to the front. Ruby carried the folder containing Ruthie's list, now supplemented with Miss Hattie's records and dozens of thank you notes. "This gathering," Pastor Isaiah said, "is about more than one person's kindness. It's about how love multiplies when we share it, how faith grows stronger when we lift each other up." A man with a camera stepped forward, Kevin Chen from the local paper. "Could I get a photo?" he asked. "This is a story people need to hear." Earl and Ruby stood together, holding the folder between them. Their joined hands rested on top of the papers that documented years of quiet generosity. Kevin snapped several pictures as the crowd watched. "One more thing," Deacon Lorraine announced. She unveiled a framed photograph of Ruthie, taken in front of the church years ago. Her smile radiated warmth even through the glass. "This will hang in the fellowship hall to remind us that the smallest act of kindness can change a life." Earl stared at his wife's face, at her eyes that had seen so much possibility in others. The room around him hummed with the evidence of her vision, lives touched, dreams supported, futures launched with nothing more than faith and a helping hand. For the first time since Ruthie's passing, the ache in his heart felt different. Not just grief, but gratitude. Not just loss, but legacy. Looking at the gathered faces, hearing their stories, feeling Ruby's hand steady in his, Earl realized something profound. They might not have much money, but they were rich in ways that mattered most. The fellowship continued as people filled their plates and shared memories. Earl sat with Mia on his lap, watching his granddaughter soak in the love that filled the room. Ruby orchestrated group photos and collected contact information, building connections that would last beyond this evening. Kevin Chen sat nearby, scribbling notes as people told their stories. His camera captured moments throughout the night, the choir singing, children playing, elders blessing the food, and most importantly, a community discovering how deeply they were connected through one woman's quiet acts of faith. Earl's hands shook as he spread the morning newspaper across his kitchen table. The headline screamed in bold letters, "Local troublemakers stir up class warfare." Below it, a photo showed Earl and Ruby at the Ruthie supper, but the caption painted a different picture. "Out-of-town activist Ruby Alvarez manipulates grieving widower." The coffee in his mug grew cold as he read Brent Hallowell's carefully crafted quotes. "We've always supported this community," Brent claimed. "It saddens me to see outsiders taking advantage of a respected veteran's grief to push their agenda." The article twisted everything. It described Earl as a once proud serviceman now being used as a puppet. It called Ruby a professional agitator with a history of stirring up trouble. Even the Ruthie supper was portrayed as a calculated publicity stunt. "Grandpa," Mia stood in her pajamas, clutching her stuffed rabbit. "Why does your picture look mad in the paper?" Earl quickly folded the newspaper. "Some people don't like what we're doing, baby." But don't you worry about that. His phone buzzed with a text from Ruby. Turn on Channel 4. There was Brent on the morning news, wearing an expensive suit and his practiced smile. As Maple Run's largest property owner, I've invested millions in this community, he said smoothly. These baseless accusations of discrimination hurt everyone. We follow all fair housing laws. The reporter turned to face the camera. Mr. Hallowell has announced plans to create a new community foundation, promising affordable housing for veterans. Earl switched off the TV. His chest felt tight. This was how it always worked. The powerful wrote their own story, while folks like him got painted as troublemakers. Ruby called moments later. Don't let him get to you, Earl. This is what they always do when she stopped mid-sentence. Earl, are you there? Something wrong? I just got a text from Pastor Isaiah. You need to come to the church. Now. Earl dropped Mia at Miss Hattie's and hurried to First Baptist. He saw it from a block away. Crude red letters sprayed across the white walls. Outside agitators go home, and worse messages he wouldn't repeat. Ruby stood with Pastor Isaiah and Deacon Lorraine, their faces grim. Other church members gathered, some crying, others taking photos for the police report. This isn't random, Ruby said quietly. The timing, right after Brent's media blitz. Lord have mercy, Deacon Lorraine muttered, touching the defaced wall. Pastor Isaiah cleared his throat. Well, we can stand here looking at hate, or we can wash it away. Who's got cleaning supplies? Within an hour, cars filled the parking lot. People arrived with buckets, scrub brushes, and determination. Miss Hattie brought Mia and other children, keeping them busy making encouragement posters. The VFW sent over coffee and donuts. Earl worked alongside Ruby, scrubbing at the angry red letters. His arms ached, but he refused to stop. This was about more than graffiti. This was about who got to tell their story. You know what this reminds me of? Ruby dipped her brush in soapy water. When I was in law school, someone painted slurs on the Multicultural Center. You know what we did? Gathered outside with candles and sang civil rights songs all night. The sun began to set as they finished cleaning. The walls were clear but slightly discolored where the graffiti had been. Pastor Isaiah gathered everyone in a circle. Some people think hate can silence love, he said. They're wrong. Deacon Lorraine, would you lead us in This Little Light of Mine? Deacon Lorraine's strong voice rose in the twilight. Others joined in, the harmony swelling as stars appeared above them. Earl felt Mia's small hand slip into his as they sang. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. The voices carried across the church lawn. Neighbors emerged from their homes. Cars slowed as they passed. The circle grew larger as more people joined them. Ruby squeezed Earl's other hand. In the gathering darkness, with voices raised in song, the weight of the day's attacks seemed to lift slightly. The newspaper lies and painted hate couldn't stand against this. A community standing together, singing under the stars. They weren't just washing away graffiti. They were refusing to let anyone else write their story. The singing continued as night settled fully over them. Earl looked at the faces illuminated by the church's porch lights. Black, white, Latino, young, old, all joining their voices together. This was Maple Run's true story, not the one Brent tried to tell in his press releases. Earl felt the familiar ache of history, decades of similar battles fought by folks just trying to claim their dignity. But here, in this circle of neighbors lifting their voices to the stars, he also felt something else. The unshakable strength of people who refused to be silenced. The fluorescent lights of the courthouse hallway buzzed overhead as Earl adjusted his tie for the 10th time. His hands trembled slightly as he smoothed down the borrowed suit jacket, a gift from Pastor Isaiah for this very day. Ruby sat beside him on the wooden bench, reviewing papers one last time. Her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose as she muttered legal terms under her breath. Every few minutes, she'd reach over and pat Earl's knee, a gesture meant to calm them both. "Remember," she said softly, "just tell the truth. That's all we need. Your story, your real story, is more powerful than any fancy legal language." Earl nodded, his throat tight. The hallway was filling up with familiar faces. Miss Hattie had brought a group from the church. Several former plant workers sat together, their own work-worn hands clutching similar pension documents. Even Tasha from the airline had taken the day off to be here. "All rise." The bailiff's voice carried through the opening courtroom doors. Inside, Earl's footsteps echoed on the polished floor as he made his way to the witness stand. He could feel Brent Hallowell's expensive legal team watching him, their suits crisp and faces impassive. Brent himself sat among them, wearing a carefully constructed expression of concerned disappointment. The oath felt heavy on Earl's tongue. "I do solemnly swear." Ruby approached the podium, her advocacy face on, the one that showed no fear. "Mr. Walker, please tell the court about your employment at Maple Run Manufacturing." Earl cleared his throat. 32 years on the line, started right after my Army service. Worked my way up to shift supervisor. "And your pension agreement?" "Company matched our contributions. Had it in writing. Still got the papers here." Earl patted his breast pocket where the worn document sat. "Was supposed to be enough for Ruthie and me to live decent. Maybe help with our granddaughter's schooling." "What happened to that pension, Mr. Walker?" One of Brent's lawyers stood. "Objection, Your Honor. The bankruptcy settlement was fully adjudicated." "Your Honor," Ruby countered, "we're establishing a pattern of corporate manipulation that directly connects to current housing discrimination." The judge, a stern-faced woman with steel-gray hair, peered over her glasses. "I'll allow it. But stay focused, Ms. Alvarez." Earl described the day they learned the pension fund had evaporated, how the company filed for bankruptcy while the executives got bonuses. How a mysterious nonprofit, one he now knew was connected to Brent, had somehow ended up with the factory's assets. "And now," Ruby continued, "the same individual controlling that nonprofit owns your housing community?" "Yes, ma'am. Mr. Hallowell bought up most of the trailer park lots, raised rents, started making it real hard for certain folks to stay." "Could you elaborate on certain folks?" Earl's voice strengthened. "Veterans on fixed incomes, families with children, especially if those children happen to be." He glanced at Brent's table. "Well, if they looked like my granddaughter Mia." Ruby introduced documents, maintenance requests ignored for some residents while quickly fulfilled for others. Rent increases that seemed to target specific families. The pattern emerged, clear as day to anyone willing to see it. "Your Honor," Ruby said, "we're asking the court to recognize this class action. The pension theft and housing discrimination are part of the same systematic effort to profit from vulnerable residents." Brent's lead attorney rose smoothly. "Your Honor, this is a fishing expedition. Mr. Walker's pension grievance was settled years ago in bankruptcy court. As for the housing complaints, we have extensive documentation of our fair practices." The cross-examination was brutal. They tried to paint Earl as bitter, confused, manipulated by activists. But Earl kept his voice steady, thinking of Ruthie's Bible verses about standing firm in truth. "Isn't it true," the defense attorney pressed, "that you've fallen behind on rent several times?" "Yes, sir. Since losing my pension, things have been tight." "And isn't Ms. Alvarez promising to solve your financial problems with this lawsuit?" Earl sat straighter. "Ruby hasn't promised me a dime. This isn't about money. It's about right and wrong, about dignity, about making sure what happened to us doesn't keep happening to others." The judge called a recess to review the filing. Earl's legs felt shaky as he left the witness stand. Ruby squeezed his arm as he passed. In the hallway, Miss Hattie pulled him into a fierce hug. "You did good, Earl Walker." Ruthie would be proud. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of legal arguments. Finally, the judge cleared her throat. "I'm taking this under advisement," she announced. "The connection between the pension fund dissolution and current housing practices needs further examination. We'll reconvene next week." Outside the courthouse, Ruby was surrounded by residents wanting to join the class action. Earl stood back, watching the autumn sun slant across the steps where his neighbors gathered, all the people affected by one man's greed, all coming together. The drive home was quiet. Earl's testimony kept replaying in his mind. Had he said enough? Had he said too much? Mia was at Miss Hattie's for dinner, giving him time to decompress. He climbed the metal steps to his trailer, noticing how they creaked under his weight. The porch light flickered, another maintenance request ignored. His key turned in the lock, and he pushed open the door. Something white caught his eye. A piece of paper had been shoved underneath, the edges crisp and clean. Earl's hand shook slightly as he picked it up. The message was typed, no signature. You're making trouble. Think about your granddaughter. The October wind whipped around Earl as he trudged up the metal steps to his trailer. His bones ached from the long day, and his mind still churned with worry about the anonymous threat he'd found yesterday. But nothing could have prepared him for the stark white notice taped to his door, its official letterhead seeming to mock him in the fading daylight. Notice of eviction. Final warning. Earl's hands trembled as he tore the paper from the door. The words blurred before his eyes. 72 hours to vacate. Failure to comply will result in all personal property removed. Inside, the trailer felt colder than usual. Earl sank into his worn recliner, the eviction notice crumpling in his grip. The walls seemed to close in around him, filled with Ruthie's touches. The flowered curtains she'd sewn, the family photos, the cross-stitch blessing above the kitchen doorway. Mia's backpack lay by the door, where she'd dropped it after school, covered in the sparkly stickers she loved. Her latest art project, a crayon drawing of their trailer with flowers all around it, was proudly displayed on the refrigerator. How could he tell her they might lose their home? The phone rang, startling him from his thoughts. It was Ruby. "Earl, are you sitting down?" Her voice carried a weight that made his stomach sink further. "The nonprofit board. They've suspended me. Someone's been pressuring our donors, saying I'm pursuing a vendetta instead of helping the community." Earl closed his eyes. "Brent? Has to be. But that's not why I'm calling. A friend at Social Services gave me a heads up. They're sending someone to inspect your place tomorrow. Someone filed a complaint about the trailer park being unsafe for children." The room spun slightly. Earl gripped the armrest of his chair. "Mia, I'll be there with you," Ruby promised. "We'll show them everything's fine." But when the social worker arrived the next morning, she seemed determined to find problems. Earl had spent half the night cleaning, but her pencil scratched endlessly across her notepad. Unstable steps, potential mold in bathroom, proximity to industrial area. She peered at the ceiling, where a water stain marked the corner. How long has this leak been present? 3 weeks? Earl admitted. Put in maintenance requests, but multiple unanswered maintenance issues, she muttered, writing again. Mia sat at the kitchen table, watching with wide eyes as the woman moved through their home. Ruby stood beside Earl, her hand occasionally squeezing his arm when the social worker's questions became particularly pointed. And the child's bedroom? The social worker's heels clicked on the linoleum as she moved down the narrow hallway. Earl followed, his chest tight. Mia's got everything she needs. Books, proper bed, good clothes. Mr. Walker, the social worker cut him off. I'm concerned about the overall environment here. The structural issues, the pending eviction. We need to ensure stable housing for the child. This is her home, Earl said, his voice rough. She's got her school friends here, her routine. Sometimes what feels like home isn't what's best for a child. She closed her notebook with a snap. We'll be monitoring the situation closely. If your housing status becomes uncertain, we may need to discuss temporary placement options. The words hit Earl like a physical blow. Temporary placement. Foster care. The very thing he'd promised Ruthie would never happen to their granddaughter. After the social worker left, Mia climbed into Earl's lap, something she hadn't done in months. Are they going to take me away, Grandpa? No, baby. He held her close, breathing in the strawberry scent of her shampoo. Nobody's taking you anywhere. But that evening, after Ruby had taken Mia for ice cream to lift her spirits, Earl sat in the darkening trailer and faced the truth. His options were running out. The class action lawsuit was their best hope for long-term change, but it wouldn't stop an eviction, wouldn't keep Child Services from deciding Mia needed a more stable environment. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Coffee at the diner? 20 minutes. Come alone." Earl's first instinct was to delete it, but desperation made him grab his keys instead. The diner was nearly empty. Brent Hallowell sat in a back booth, looking perfectly at ease in his expensive sweater. A manila envelope lay on the table before him. "Earl." Brent gestured to the seat across from him. "Coffee?" Earl shook his head. "Fair enough." Brent smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'll be brief. This situation has gotten out of hand. Bad for everyone involved. But it doesn't have to end badly." He slid the envelope across the table. "Inside you'll find a cashier's check, enough for a down payment on a modest house in a better neighborhood. Somewhere more. Appropriate for raising a child." Earl's fingers twitched toward the envelope, but didn't touch it. "All you have to do," Brent continued smoothly, "is sign a non-disclosure agreement and drop the lawsuit. You and your granddaughter get a fresh start. Everyone wins. The money would solve everything. A real house for Mia. No more social workers measuring their worth by water stains and rusty steps. No more lying awake, wondering if tomorrow would bring another eviction notice." But Ruthie's Bible verse echoed in his mind. "If you're reading this, we gave it where it would grow." Earl sat alone in his dark trailer hours later, the envelope unopened on his kitchen table. The temptation to take Brent's offer gnawed at him. He could almost hear Ruthie's voice. Sometimes doing right costs everything. But hadn't it cost enough already? His pension, his dignity, maybe soon his home, and now possibly even Mia. The thought of failing his granddaughter, of breaking his promise to Ruthie to keep their family together, felt like a physical weight crushing his chest. Outside, the security light flickered, casting strange shadows through the windows. Earl hadn't bothered turning on any lamps. The darkness suited his mood as he wrestled with the choice before him. Take the money, give Mia a better life, or keep fighting a battle that seemed more hopeless with each passing day. He reached for Ruthie's Bible, his fingers finding the worn pages in the dark. But for the first time since her death, he couldn't bear to open it. Couldn't face her marginal notes about faith and persistence. Not when he was sitting here, contemplating taking blood money from the man who'd helped steal their future. The envelope seemed to mock him from the table, offering an easy way out that would cost only his soul. "I'm sorry, Ruthie," he whispered into the darkness. "I don't know how to fix this one." Earl sat in the church sanctuary as morning light filtered through stained glass, casting colorful shadows across the worn pews. His hands trembled slightly as they held Ruthie's Bible. The emptiness of the space matched the hollow feeling in his chest after that late-night diner meeting with Brent. The creak of the heavy wooden doors broke the silence. Miss Hattie's careful footsteps echoed through the sanctuary, her cane tapping a steady rhythm on the hardwood floor. Under her arm, she carried what looked like an old accounting book, its leather cover cracked with age. "Thought I might find you here," she said, easing herself into the pew beside him. Her wire-rimmed glasses caught the morning light as she studied his face. "You've got that same look Ruthie used to get when she was wrestling with something big." Earl managed a weak smile. "That obvious, huh?" "To these old eyes? Clear as day." She patted the ledger in her lap. "And I think maybe this might help with whatever's troubling you." She opened the book carefully, its pages yellow with age but covered in neat, precise handwriting. "You see, I kept track of things over the years. Not just school records, mind you, but the quiet things, the important things." Earl leaned closer, squinting at the entries. Each page was filled with dates, names, and amounts. October 15th, 1998. Miss Hattie read. Ruthie Walker, $350 to Sandra Martinez for textbooks. She turned another page. December 3rd, 1998. 500 to James Williams for winter tuition. Earl's throat tightened as she continued reading. Entry after entry, year after year, each one documenting Ruthie's secret generosity. But something else caught his eye. The dates. Wait, he said, pointing to a cluster of entries from 2008. These dates, they match up with when the plant was going through bankruptcy, when our pension funds started disappearing. The sanctuary doors opened again. Ruby hurried in, followed by an elderly woman Earl didn't recognize. The woman clutched a manila envelope to her chest, her eyes darting nervously around the church. "Earl," Ruby called out softly, mindful of the sacred space. "This is Margaret Peters. She was a clerk at the federal courthouse during the plant bankruptcy." Margaret nodded, her silver hair catching the morning light. "I've been following your story in the papers. When I saw that photo of you and Ms. Alvarez..." She paused, clutching the envelope tighter. "There were things that never sat right with me about that bankruptcy filing." She sat down in the pew in front of them, turning to face Earl and Miss Hattie. Documents would come in late at night. Important ones would get misfiled until after crucial deadlines. But I kept copies. Her hands shook slightly as she opened the envelope, and I kept notes of my own. Earl watched as she spread papers across the wooden pew. Court filings, transfer records, handwritten notes on legal pad paper, all yellowed with age, but preserved with careful attention to detail. Miss Hattie adjusted her glasses, comparing dates in her ledger to the court documents. "Look here," she said, pointing to several entries. "Every time a large sum vanished from the pension fund. There's a matching deposit to Brent's Shell Company," Ruby finished, her voice tight with controlled anger. "And within days. Ruthie would somehow find exactly what someone needed," Earl whispered, pieces clicking into place. "She must have figured it out. Must have known somehow where that money was really going." Margaret nodded. "The amounts match perfectly. When pension funds would disappear into administrative fees or consulting charges, your wife would step in with just enough to keep someone's dreams alive." She smiled sadly. It was like she was trying to right a wrong, one student at a time. Earl's vision blurred as he stared at the documents spread before them. His wife's secret mission, revealed in black and white. While he'd been angry about their dwindling savings, she'd been waging a quiet war against injustice, armed with nothing but her own generosity. "This is it," Ruby said, her voice gaining strength. "This is what we needed." Margaret's affidavit about the mishandled documents, combined with Miss Hattie's ledger showing the pattern, she reached for Earl's hand. "We can prove the connection between the pension theft and Brent's current real estate empire." Miss Hattie closed her ledger gently. "Ruthie always said records were like seeds. Plant them right, and truth grows where you need it most." Earl ran his fingers over Ruthie's Bible, feeling the familiar worn leather under his touch. The weight of Brent's envelope, still sitting unopened on his kitchen table, seemed to fade away. In its place, he felt something else growing, something that felt a lot like hope. "We're not done yet," he whispered, holding the Bible close. The morning light streamed stronger through the stained glass now, painting the sanctuary in warm colors that reminded him of Ruthie's smile. The courthouse steps gleamed in the early morning sun as Earl straightened his tie one last time. His hand shook slightly, but Ruby's steady presence beside him helped calm his nerves. Behind them, a stream of familiar faces climbed the stone steps, neighbors, church members, and those whose lives Ruthie had touched over the years. "Deep breaths," Ruby whispered, adjusting her own suit jacket. Her usual warm smile was replaced by a look of fierce determination. "Remember what we practiced." The security checkpoint buzzed with activity as dozens of Maple Run residents filed through. Earl recognized faces from the VFW hall, the church choir, and even Tasha from the airline counter, who had taken a day off to be here. Miss Hattie sat in her wheelchair, Margaret Peters pushing her carefully, the precious ledger secured in her lap. In the marble hallway outside courtroom 3, Deacon Lorraine gathered the choir members. Their hushed voices blended in gentle harmony as they practiced Leaning on the Everlasting Arms, Ruthie's favorite. The sound echoed off the high ceilings, wrapping around Earl like a familiar embrace. "Quite the turnout," Pastor Isaiah said, appearing at Earl's side. He carried a thermos of coffee and passed Earl a steaming cup. "The whole town's been praying." Earl's hand steadied as he took a sip. "Didn't expect so many folks to show up on a workday. Some things matter more than a day's wages," the pastor replied, nodding toward the growing crowd. "Look there. Even Mrs. Chen closed her grocery store to be here." Through the courtroom's heavy wooden doors, Earl could see Brent Hallowell and his team of lawyers setting up at their table. Their expensive suits and leather briefcases seemed to gleam under the fluorescent lights. Brent caught Earl's eye and smirked, but Earl noticed a slight tremor in the man's hand as he reached for his water glass. Ruby touched Earl's elbow. "It's time," she said softly. "You ready?" Earl thought of Mia, safe at school today with her favorite teacher keeping her distracted. He thought of Ruthie, whose quiet acts of generosity had brought them all to this moment. He squared his shoulders, "Ready as I'll ever be." They entered the courtroom together, Ruby's heels clicking purposefully on the polished floor. The wooden benches creaked as people shifted to make room for each other. Earl saw faces from every corner of Maple Run, black, white, Hispanic, Asian, all mixed together like a living picture of what their town could be. Margaret Peters sat directly behind the plaintiff's table, her manila envelope of evidence placed carefully before her. Miss Hattie's ledger rested beside it, its worn cover a stark contrast to the sleek laptops Brent's lawyers were opening. The bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise. The Court of the Third District is now in session, the Honorable Judge Miriam Cohen presiding." Judge Cohen entered, her black robes flowing as she took her seat. Her sharp eyes surveyed the packed courtroom, lingering briefly on the diverse crowd before settling on the parties before her. "Be seated," she said, her voice clear and firm. "We're here to address new evidence in the matter of Walker versus Hallowell Industries regarding pension fund allocation and discriminatory housing practices." She peered over her reading glasses. "I understand there are additional documents for consideration?" Ruby stood, her voice steady. "Yes, Your Honor. We have evidence demonstrating a clear pattern of fund misappropriation during the 2008 bankruptcy proceedings, corroborated by courthouse records and independent financial documentation." As Ruby presented Margaret's affidavit and Miss Hattie's ledger, Earl watched Judge Cohen's expression. Her eyes narrowed as she examined the dates, the matching amounts, the careful notes that painted a picture of systematic theft hidden behind legal paperwork. One of Brent's lawyers jumped up. "Your Honor, these are merely coincidental timestamps and unverified personal records. They hardly constitute. I'll determine what constitutes evidence in my courtroom." Judge Cohen interrupted, still studying the documents. "Ms. Peters, you maintained these records during your tenure as court clerk?" Margaret stood, her voice thin but clear. "Yes, Your Honor. I documented every irregular filing and unusual procedure. The pattern was clear, but at the time, there was no one willing to listen." The judge nodded slowly, then turned her attention to Miss Hattie's ledger. "And these charitable distributions, you can verify their authenticity?" "Every single one," Miss Hattie declared. "I kept track of every donation Ruthie Walker made. And if you'll notice, Your Honor, they match perfectly with the administrative fees that Mr. Hallowell's company charged to the pension fund." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Earl saw Brent shift uncomfortably in his chair, whispering urgently to his lawyers. The smirk was gone now, replaced by something that looked a lot like worry. Judge Cohen held up her hand for silence. "Mr. Hallowell, would you care to explain these correlations?" Brent stood, straightening his expensive tie. "Your Honor, this is clearly an attempt to—" "I remind you," Judge Cohen cut in, "that you are under oath. And I see here that your previous testimony regarding fund allocation directly contradicts these records." She tapped the documents meaningfully. "I would consider your next words very carefully." The courtroom held its breath. Earl felt Ruby's hand squeeze his arm. Behind them, the choir members clasped hands, their earlier hymns replaced by silent prayers. Judge Cohen sat back, her expression stern. "Based on this new evidence, I am reopening this case for full review." "And Mr. Hallowell?" She fixed him with a steely gaze. "Given the discrepancies between these records and your sworn testimony, I strongly suggest you consult with your attorneys regarding the penalties for perjury in this court." The tension in the room broke like a summer storm. A wave of whispers swept through the benches, hope rising in every murmured word. Earl closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of the moment settle around him like a blessing. The morning headlines screamed across the front page of the Maple Run Gazette. "State Attorney General joins pension fraud case." Earl stared at the paper spread across his kitchen table, coffee growing cold beside him. Ruby had texted him the news at dawn, but seeing it in black and white made it feel more real. Through his trailer window, he could see the morning news vans lined up along Magnolia Drive, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal flowers. But they weren't here for him. They were headed to Brent Hallowell's mansion on the hill. The phone rang, making Earl jump. It was Ruby. "Turn on Channel 4, she said without preamble. "They're live at Hallowell's gate." Earl fumbled with the remote, and his small TV flickered to life. There was Brent's sprawling estate, its manicured lawns now dotted with reporters and camera crews. A stern-faced woman in a navy suit stood at the center of the frame, holding a microphone. "Breaking news from Maple Run, Michigan, where the state attorney general's office has announced it will join a class-action lawsuit against prominent businessman Brent Hallowell. The case alleges systematic pension fraud and discriminatory housing practices affecting hundreds of former auto workers and current residents." The camera panned to show dark-suited figures walking up Brent's driveway, carrying briefcases and boxes. State investigators, Earl realized, there to collect evidence. "They're executing a search warrant," Ruby explained over the phone. "The AG's office thinks there might be more documents hidden away in his home office." Earl watched as Brent's security gate swung open, admitting the officials. The mansion's heavy front door opened, revealing Brent himself. Even through the TV screen, Earl could see how different he looked. Gone was the smooth confidence, replaced by dark circles under his eyes and a suit that seemed to hang loosely on his frame. "Mr. Hallowell," reporters called out, "what's your response to the Attorney General's involvement? Do you deny misappropriating pension funds? Will you address the discrimination allegations?" Brent's lawyers hustled him back inside, but not before the cameras caught his expression, a mixture of fury and fear that made Earl think of a cornered animal. The doorbell rang, startling Earl again. He opened it to find Deacon Lorraine on his steps, clutching a folder. "You seeing all this?" she asked, stepping inside. She spread the folder's contents across his kitchen table, printouts of email chains and financial records. "Miss Hattie's nephew works at the state capitol. Says they've been building this case against Hallowell for months, just waiting for the right evidence to surface." Earl studied the papers, remembering all those years of working the assembly line, trusting that his pension would be there when he needed it. "What happens now?" "Now?" Deacon Lorraine's eyes sparkled. "Now we watch that house of cards tumble down." Over the next few days, Earl's TV stayed tuned to the local news. More revelations emerged hourly. Former employees of Hallowell Industries came forward with stories of document shredding and suspicious wire transfers. The AG's office discovered offshore accounts. Brent's business partners began distancing themselves, their carefully worded statements filling the evening broadcasts. Ruby called every few hours with updates. "His board of directors is jumping ship," she reported one afternoon, "and the museum? They're voting tonight to remove his name from the wing he donated." The pressure mounted. Protesters gathered outside Hallowell's office building downtown. The Union Hall hosted emergency meetings for former workers affected by the pension theft. Local banks froze accounts pending investigation, Then came the morning Ruby burst into Earl's trailer without knocking, waving a legal document. "They're offering a deal," she announced, spreading the papers on his table. "Brent's lawyers want to negotiate. Part of the settlement includes selling off his real estate holdings, including this trailer park." Earl's heart skipped. Selling to who? Ruby's smile widened. "That's the best part. Remember that church credit union meeting last month, when we discussed forming a resident co-op?" She tapped the document. "They're willing to back us. The union retiree fund, too. We can buy this place ourselves, run it our way." Earl sank into a chair, overwhelmed. "The whole park?" "Every lot. No more discriminatory practices. No more random rent hikes. We'd set fair rates, make repairs fairly." She pulled out another document. "And look who they want to sign as the resident representative." There was his name, Earl Walker. The next week passed in a blur of meetings and paperwork. Lawyers explained terms. Bank officers reviewed financing. Community members voted on bylaws. Through it all, Earl kept thinking of Ruthie, wondering if she somehow knew this day would come when she was quietly giving away their savings to help others. Finally, on a crisp fall morning, Earl found himself in a downtown conference room, sitting across from a very different Brent Hallowell. Gone was the designer suit, replaced by something off the rack. His usual commanding presence had deflated, leaving him looking older and smaller. The lawyers handled most of the talking. Numbers were discussed, papers were passed, pens scratched signatures. Earl noticed Brent's hand trembling slightly as he signed away the property he'd used to torment so many families. Then it was Earl's turn. He picked up the pen, its weight familiar from all the overtime slips he'd signed over the years at the plant. Ruby stood beside him, her hand resting supportively on his shoulder. He thought of Mia doing homework at their kitchen table, of neighbors gathering on front porches, of community meetings in the VFW hall. He signed his name clearly, each letter a declaration. Earl James Walker. The lawyers shuffled papers, made copies, shook hands. Brent stood abruptly and left without a word, his footsteps echoing down the hall. Ruby waited until the room had cleared before pulling something from her briefcase, a ring of keys, newly cut and gleaming. "The property deed is being recorded right now," she said softly, pressing the keys into Earl's weathered palm. "But these make it real. You're not just a resident anymore, Earl. You're an owner. All of you are." Earl closed his fingers around the keys, feeling their edges bite into his skin. These weren't just keys to a trailer park. They were keys to security, to dignity, to a future where his granddaughter could grow up without fear of eviction notices on the door. "First thing tomorrow," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "we're taking down that Hallowell Properties sign at the entrance." Ruby smiled. "And what should we put up instead?" Earl thought of all the hands that had joined together to make this moment possible. Ruthie's quiet generosity, Ruby's fierce advocacy, the community's unwavering support. "Something that shows we own it together," he said, the keys warm in his grip. "Something that shows we're home." The wooden pews of First Methodist Church creaked under the weight of anticipation. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the assembled faces. Factory workers, teachers, nurses, mechanics, and dozens of others whose lives Ruthie Walker had touched. Earl stood at the podium, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the microphone. Mia sat in the front row, wearing her best Sunday dress, beaming up at her grandfather. Ruby sat beside her, nodding encouragement. "Most of you know me as Earl Walker," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "And you knew my wife Ruthie, though it turns out some of you knew her better than I did." A gentle laugh rippled through the congregation. "For years, she was quietly helping students, giving away what little we had. I used to think we were poor because of bad luck or timing. Now I know we were rich in ways I couldn't see." He pulled out a wrinkled envelope from his jacket pocket. "The settlement from Hallowell Industries is restoring part of our pensions. That's justice, and we're grateful." But Ruthie taught us something more important than money. She taught us that generosity multiplies. Ruby stood and joined Earl at the podium, carrying a leather portfolio. "That's why today we're announcing the creation of the Ruthie Walker Foundation," she said, her voice clear and strong. "It will provide first-step scholarships to students who need just a little help to make their dreams possible, just like Ruthie did for me." A murmur of approval swept through the church. Deacon Lorraine dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Miss Hattie nodded vigorously from her usual spot near the altar. "The foundation will be seeded with a portion of the settlement funds," Ruby continued. "But what makes this special is how the community has stepped up. Former recipients have pledged to contribute. Local businesses are matching donations. The VFW has offered space for our offices." Earl cleared his throat. "Ruby will serve as the foundation's director. There's no one better to carry forward Ruthie's spirit of giving. I'll be on the board, though I'm keeping my part-time job at the VFW." He smiled. "Someone's got to pour coffee for the old soldiers." Pastor Isaiah stepped forward, raising his hands. "Let us pray for this new chapter," he began, but was interrupted by the sound of the church doors swinging open. Tasha Reed, the airline gate agent who'd first helped organize the Ruthie supper, hurried down the center aisle. She carried a large poster board covered by a cloth. "Sorry I'm late," she called out, "but I couldn't miss this announcement, especially since I have one of my own to make." She propped the covered board on an easel near the podium. "Remember how this all started? With a chance meeting on a plane, a handkerchief offered to dry tears?" She looked at Earl and Ruby. "Well, the airline loved that story so much, they've agreed to help us create something special." Tasha pulled the cloth away, revealing a colorful poster. At the top, in bold letters, it read, "Ruthie Ripples Day, Paying It Forward Takes Flight. Once a year," Tasha explained, "we'll provide travel vouchers to reunite Ruthie's scholarship recipients with their families. But more than that, each person who received help will pledge to help another student, creating new ripples of generosity." The church erupted in applause. From the choir loft, children's voices began to sing, a simple melody about kindness spreading like rings in still water. Earl recognized some of them as children of people Ruthie had helped years ago. Ruby squeezed Earl's hand as they watched the young faces singing. A tear rolled down his weathered cheek, but his smile was radiant. In that moment, he felt Ruthie's presence as clearly as the sunlight streaming through the windows, not in sadness or loss, but in the joy of promises kept and love multiplied. The children's voices soared to the rafters, like ripples in the water, like light from star to star. "The kindness that you showed me will travel near and far." Earl closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him. He thought of that day on the plane, how a simple act of offering his handkerchief had set all this in motion. He thought of Ruthie's quiet wisdom in giving away their savings, planting seeds she knew would grow into something beautiful. Through his tears, he watched the next generation singing about the power of kindness, and his heart swelled with gratitude. The foundation would ensure that Ruthie's legacy lived on, touching lives she'd never even imagined, creating ripples that would spread far beyond their small town. The morning light caught the framed handkerchief hanging on the church wall, the one that had dried Ruby's tears that day on the plane, and made it glow like a banner of hope. The porch swing creaked gently as Earl and Mia swayed in the soft evening breeze. The setting sun painted the sky in gentle pinks and purples, casting long shadows across their now secure home. Inside, through the screen door, the freshly painted walls glowed warmly in the fading light. Earl held the simple wooden frame in his hands, carefully positioning the laundered handkerchief behind the glass. The white cloth, pressed and clean, bore the faintest trace of wear at its edges, a testament to its journey from a cramped airplane seat to this moment. "What's that, Grandpa?" Mia asked, her small fingers tracing the edge of the frame. Earl smiled, securing the backing with careful precision. "This handkerchief here? It's got quite a story, sweetheart." He stood up, carrying the frame inside with Mia trailing behind him like a curious shadow. Above the mantel hung Ruthie's photograph, her kind eyes and gentle smile frozen in time. Earl positioned the framed handkerchief beside it, adjusting it until it sat just right. "See? Not too long ago, I was on an airplane," Earl began, settling back into his favorite armchair. Mia climbed onto his lap, her eyes bright with interest. "I was worried about money and missing your grandma something fierce, like you do sometimes when you get quiet?" Mia asked, touching his cheek with her small hand. Earl nodded, his throat tightening slightly. "Just like that. And next to me sat this lady, Miss Ruby, and she was crying." "Miss Ruby was crying?" Mia's eyes widened. She knew Ruby as the strong, smiling woman who brought cookies and helped organize community meetings. She sure was. She was holding an old Girl Scout badge and thinking about people who'd helped her when she was younger. Earl gestured to the handkerchief in its frame, so I gave her that handkerchief to dry her tears. Through the open windows they could hear the distant sound of voices gathering at the church. The evening hymn sing would be starting soon. "And you know what we found out?" Earl continued, his voice warm with memory. "That lady she was crying about, the one who'd helped her go to school, was your Grandma Ruthie." Mia looked up at Ruthie's photograph, then back at Earl. "Grandma helped Miss Ruby?" "She did. She helped lots of people, quietly, when they needed it most." Earl hugged Mia closer. "And because of that one handkerchief, because your grandma taught me that kindness matters more than money, we found a whole community of friends who helped us keep our home." The screen door creaked open as Ruby herself stepped onto the porch. She wore a simple summer dress, her advocacy badge pinned proudly to the collar. "Are you two coming to the hymn sing?" she called through the window. "Can we go, Grandpa?" Mia bounced on Earl's knee. "Of course we can, sugar." Earl stood, setting Mia down gently. He paused to straighten the frame one last time, his fingers lingering on the glass. They joined Ruby on the porch, where other neighbors were already gathering. Miss Hattie walked arm in arm with Deacon Lorraine. Pastor Isaiah carried his guitar. Even Tasha had driven in from the airport, still wearing her uniform. The evening air was sweet with the scent of late summer flowers. Lightning bugs began to flicker in the growing dusk, like tiny stars come down to earth. As they walked toward the church, more people fell in step beside them, factory workers, teachers, students, all the lives touched by Ruthie's quiet generosity. The church windows glowed with warm light, and the sound of the choir practicing drifted out into the twilight. They climbed the steps together, pausing at the top. Earl looked at the faces around him, black, white, young, old, all linked by something stronger than circumstance. Ruby squeezed his hand. "Who would have thought, Earl, that day on the plane, when a poor dad sat next to a crying woman?" Earl finished, his voice thick with emotion. Mia tugged at his sleeve. "And their connection was worth more than money," she added proudly, repeating the phrase she'd heard so often. The choir voices swelled into the night air as they stood together, hands linked, ready to add their own voices to the song. Earl looked at the people around him, his family now, bound by something far precious than gold, and knew that Ruthie would be proud. If you enjoyed the story, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.